The silence was a luxurious tapestry, embroidered with the distant ticking of a Swiss watch and the whisper of the breeze against the tempered glass. On that cold morning, the sun, treacherous and golden, invaded the office of Alexander Sterling, a tech billionaire who viewed the world through a filter of disillusionment. The brightness obscured the invisible dust, but not the moral stain he sensed on the soul of every human being. In a corner, Mrs. Elena, a woman with tired features but firm movements, polished the ebony floor with the devotion of someone who finds purpose in routine. Her shoulders carried the silent weight of years of work, but her dignity was an invisible shield separating her from the opulence around her. Elena's daughter, Sophia, an 8-year-old girl, sat in a large leather armchair. Her feet didn't reach the floor, and she swung her legs around, oblivious to the monumentality of the place. Her short fingers held an orange crayon, the tip coloring the rough surface of a pad of paper. Her old faded coat, a stark contrast to the richness of the surroundings, seemed like a cocoon harboring an ancient spirit. Sophia didn't speak. Her eyes, large and expressive, absorbed every detail, every shadow, every particle of light dancing in the air. She was an observer, a silent collector of impressions the world insisted on giving her. Alexander Sterling reclined in his armchair, seemingly lost in a nap that was actually a calculated pose. He watched Eleanor out of the corner of his eye, a game he enjoyed playing with his employees. He tested their ethics with small slips and watched their reactions. But Sophia's presence, a point of light and simplicity in that sanctuary of power, disturbed him. He saw her as an extension of his mother, a miniature version of the vulnerability he so disdained, yet which, at the same time, intrigued him. The child, so small and so oblivious to the complexity of that world, was an enigma. The stillness was the stage where an invisible drama unfolded. The sunlight revealed the thin layer of skepticism that covered Sterling, a second skin he had cultivated over the years. He didn't see Mrs. Elena as a cleaning lady, but as an archetype, a representation of futile effort. And Sophia, to him, was innocence on the verge of corruption. The air in the room, heavy and opulent, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move. It was the calm before the storm, a moment of peace that would be shattered by a test, a silent provocation that would test not greed, but the very essence of humanity. The contrast between opulence and simplicity, between power and vulnerability, was palpable. It was as if Sterling's office wasn't just an office, but a battleground where two philosophies of life silently clashed. He, with the arrogance of someone who believes money makes the world go round. She, with the dignity of someone who knows there are values money can't buy. And between them, Sophia, a child whose purity would tip the scales in an unexpected direction. The stage was set. The show, though without an audience, was about to begin, and its protagonist, so small and fragile, was about to become a giant. 8-year-old Sophia was a sphinx with eyes of infinite curiosity. Her clothes, a worn grey wool coat and faded jeans, seemed to whisper the story of her mother's daily struggle. But poverty had not touched her soul. She was like a rough diamond, without the polish of wealth, but with a transparency and hardness few possessed. Her dark brown eyes reflected not sadness, but the depth of someone who understands more than she says. She didn't speak, but observed, and in her silence, her precocious intelligence blossomed. Her dignity was her inheritance, an unshakable strength that protected her from the cynicism of the adult world. Alexander Sterling, on the other hand, was a monument to disillusionment. At 60, he had built an empire not only with technological innovation, but with the conviction that the world was a nest of vipers. His fortune was his armor, and his arrogance his sword. He dressed in impeccably tailored suits and shoes that shone like mirrors, But what truly defined him was his cold, suspicious gaze, which saw greed in every smile, betrayal in every handshake. He was not just a man, but a symbol of the system that rewards distrust and punishes innocence. His solitude was a dungeon he had built himself, and from which he saw no escape, nor even wanted to, for he saw it as the only reality. Mrs. Elena, Sophia's mother, was the fragile link between these two worlds. She was quiet dignity, resilience in human form, her hair tied in a tight bun, and her hands, calloused from work, told the story of a life of sacrifice. She cleaned Sterling's office with the same zeal she cared for her home, without resentment, without complaint. For her, work was not just a means of subsistence, but a form of honor, and Sophia's presence there was a constant reminder of why she cleaned the floors, why she bent her knees before opulence, for her daughter the reason for her unwavering strength. The relationship between Sterling and Sophia was a dance of invisibility and assumption. He had never exchanged a word with the girl. To him, she was merely a reflection of his mother's life, visible proof of a social class he viewed with disdain. His skeptical mind had already mapped out the girl's fate. She would be like everyone else, seduced by temptation, corrupted by necessity. He believed that dignity was a luxury poverty could not afford, and Sophia's presence in his office was not a chance encounter, but an opportunity to confirm his theory, a silent social experiment. The room, then, was not just a workspace, but a laboratory of character. The air, dense and full of contrasts, seemed to weigh heavily on Sophia's small figure. Alexander, the scientist, observed his subject, the girl he thought so predictable. He saw no dignity in her eyes, no strength in her silence. He saw only poverty, need, and opportunity. And Mrs. Elena, oblivious to the silent test that was about to begin, continued her work, moving with the grace of one accustomed to carrying a burden. The scene was set for the moral experiment. Sterling, a collector of moral failures, felt a rush of adrenaline as he prepared for his next test. He didn't do it out of malice, but out of a desperate desire to prove himself right about human nature. He wanted to see greed in action so that his solitude would seem less like a punishment and more like a wise choice. And Sophia, in her innocence, was the perfect blank canvas for his next experiment. She was the opposite of everything he represented, and the opportunity to watch her dignity crumble was a temptation he couldn't resist. Sterling's chair was his throne, and the room his kingdom. From there, he could move the pieces of his game, testing loyalty, honesty, and ambition. And Sophia was the most intriguing piece that had ever entered his board. He saw her as a fairy tale creature, a princess in rags, and the reality he thought was that fairy tales didn't exist. Life was hard, and he felt it his duty to show her the harshness of the world, to make her see that innocence was only a prelude to corruption. For Sophia, Sterling's office was a place of strange contrasts. The silence, the luxury, the smell of leather and wood. Everything was different from her home, where noise and simplicity were constant companions. She sketched a garden with flowers of every color, a refuge for her imagination. She wasn't aware of Sterling's gaze, but she felt the invisible weight of the place, as if the air were filled with a tension she couldn't comprehend. She sensed her mother's anxiety, the weight of Sterling's silence, and her innocence, like a sensitive radar, picked up the emotions adults tried to hide. Elena, Sophia's mother, was the epitome of resilience. Her strength lay not in great deeds, but in the silent repetition of small acts of kindness. She stood tall, even when fatigue threatened. She swept the crumbs from the floor, as if sweeping away the sorrows of her life. And in her heart, she harbored a single wish: that Sophia would never have to bow to injustice, that her soul would remain pure, immune to the evil she encountered every day. She didn't know about Sterling's test, but if she had, Her heart would have broken with anxiety. Sophia's presence in the office was a coincidence that would become destiny. She wasn't just the cleaning lady's daughter, but the catalyst for change, the element of surprise Sterling hadn't anticipated. He saw a ghost from the past, a memory of a time when he believed in the goodness of people, before his experience and cynicism had transformed him. And Sophia's innocence was a painful reminder of what he had lost, and what he was determined to prove didn't exist. The stage was set. Luxury and simplicity, arrogance and dignity, disillusionment and innocence, all the elements were in place. Alexander, the skeptic, prepared his experiment. Sophia, the innocent, was about to be tested. And Mrs. Elena, the dignified one, continued her work, oblivious to the moral battle that was about to unfold before her eyes, and that would change all their lives in ways no one could have foreseen. The stillness was broken by a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. As he feigned sleep, Alexander Sterling's hand slid across the ebony table, pushing his leather briefcase. The soft sound of the material on the wood was like the prelude of a drum, marking the beginning of a ritual. The briefcase shifted, revealing a stack of $100 bills, a casually arranged fortune, a feast of temptations. Sterling didn't move his head, but his eyes, beneath half-closed lids, watched the floor, the stage where his play of cynicism would be performed. The air in the room seemed to thicken, heavy with the silent anticipation of what would come next. With the precision of a magician, Sterling allowed one of the notes, a crisp green sheet, to slip from the stack. It floated in the air for a moment, like an autumn leaf, and landed on the floor, right next to the chair where Sophia sat. The paper, so insignificant in itself, seemed to glow on the floor, a point of light, a promise. Sterling's heart, rarely quickened, pounded with bitter anticipation. He was about to have his theory confirmed. He was about to see innocence corrupted. Sophia, in her childlike concentration, didn't notice right away. Her fingers continued to color the flower in her drawing, a world of beauty she had created to shield herself from reality. But the corner of her eye, a radar for details sharpened by poverty, caught the glint on the floor. She stopped drawing, the tip of the crayon still pressed against the paper. Her eyes, wide and serious, moved from the drawing to the object on the floor. It was a banknote. She had never seen so much money together. Her eyes widened, and a small breath escaped her lips. Time seemed to stand still. For Sterling, each second felt like an eternity. He waited for the reflex, the instinctive reaction. What he expected was for the girl, driven by need, to bend down, pick up the money, and hide it. He had already imagined the scene in his mind, the small act of betrayal, the confirmation that everyone, without exception, was driven by greed. He wanted to see the small hand reach out, the note disappear into a pocket. He wanted her to prove him right, so he could continue living in his world of disillusionment. The tension was a taut rope, about to snap. Sophia looked at her mother, whose back was turned, cleaning the windowsill. She didn't see her. She was alone with the money. The dilemma was silent and internal, a storm in a teacup. Her childish mind weighed the options. Taking the money would mean the possibility of helping her mother, of buying something she'd long wanted, of easing the burden a little. But her mother's voice, a voice of honor and dignity, echoed in her mind. Her mother had taught her that what isn't yours doesn't belong to you. It was a simple lesson, but one that resonated deep within her soul. Sterling's breathing was shallow, his muscles tensed, waiting for movement. He saw the hesitation on the girl's face, the battle between desire and morality. For him, desire always won. Human nature was a dirty thing, and he was eager to see further proof of his theory. He felt a twinge of satisfaction, a small triumph. His cynical belief would be validated. The silence was so heavy it felt like it had mass. Sophia tilted her head, staring at the note. It was just a piece of paper, but in her hands, it could be a revolution. She thought of her mother who worked so hard. She thought of the new shoes her mother needed, the hot soup she couldn't make. She felt the weight of poverty, a burden that even at her age she already understood. And the money on the floor seemed like the magic solution to all her problems. But magic came at a price. The price was dignity. The price was betraying her mother's lesson. And Sophia, in her innocence, understood that dignity was more valuable than any amount of money. She looked at the note, then at the door, at the exit, at freedom. She felt Sterling's invisible gaze, but she didn't know he was watching. She thought only of her mother and what she would do. And the answer, for her, was clear. She couldn't betray herself. She couldn't betray her mother. Sterling's heart pounded. He saw the girl's hand move. He smiled a bitter smile of victory. I knew it, he thought. Everyone is equal. He watched the small figure crouch down, her delicate fingers reaching for the ground. The humiliation was about to happen. The test was about to be completed, and Sophia's innocence in Sterling's mind was about to disintegrate. Mrs. Elena, in her routine, had turned for a moment to pick up a cloth. She didn't see the money. She didn't see her daughter's hand. She was immersed in her own world of work, sweat, and honor. And the scene unfolding behind her was the antithesis of everything she believed in, and the nightmare of everything she feared most. She was one step away from witnessing something she never imagined, her daughter's dignity being tested. Sophia's hand finally touched the note. The paper was smooth, cold. The sensation was strange, as if the object belonged to a world other than hers. She held it, and a thought came. To her, she could simply take it. No one would see, no one would know, and the temptation was like a voice whispering in her ear. But her mother's voice, the voice of dignity, was louder, clearer. And what she was about to do would surprise Alexander Sterling and forever change his perception of life. The tension, already heavy, began to intensify with the slowness of Sophia's movements. She didn't act impulsively. Each of her actions was a silent deliberation. She picked up the note from the floor with the delicacy of someone holding something sacred or perhaps forbidden. Sterling, from his armchair, barely breathed. He watched the scene in slow motion, every detail magnified. What he couldn't see was the girl's internal battle, the small war between desire and morality. He only saw what he wanted to see, proof of her flawed character, the fragility of her dignity. The note, in her small hands, felt like a macabre trophy. The girl shifted in her chair. Her eyes moved from the note to his hand, and she folded it with childlike yet surprisingly careful precision. The sound of the paper folding was a distinct sound in the silence of the office. With each fold, Sterling's heart filled with a bitter certainty. He smiled inwardly, a smile that would never reach his eyes, a smile of validation. He was right. He was always right. Humanity was predictable and predictably corrupt. He watched the girl, hoping that now, as he imagined, she would pocket the money, sealing her fate. But the scene didn't unfold as Sterling had anticipated. Sophia, with the folded note in her hand, didn't put it away. She didn't look at her mother, or the window, or the ground. She looked directly at Alexander Sterling. Her eyes, which he had previously thought were simple, now seemed like a well of depth. The girl's gaze held a serenity that disarmed him, a dignity he couldn't comprehend. It was a look that said, "I know what this means, but I know what's right." And Sterling, for a moment, felt a pang of unease, a pang of doubt. The humiliation Sterling had hoped to inflict on Sophia's mother upon discovering her daughter's supposed absence never materialized. Instead, the scene became a silent, personal micro-conflict between him and the child. He, the man of power and control, was now hostage to a situation he himself had created. The girl's silence, her erect posture, and her unwavering gaze were his weapons. And with each passing second, the power play he thought he was winning began to shift. The master of the game was about to be defeated by the simplest and most honest play of all. The air grew heavier. Silence, once a luxury, was now a burden. Sterling dared not move, afraid that any movement would reveal the nervousness he was beginning to feel. He, the billionaire who ruled empires, was transfixed by the gaze of a child. Power, which he believed to be a matter of money and influence, was revealing itself to be something much more complex, something that nestled in the soul, something that little Sophia possessed in abundance, and that he, in his wealth, had lost. The scene was surreal. The dignity of poverty confronted the arrogance of wealth, innocence versus cynicism, and the stage for the battle was the luxurious office, a silent witness to a confrontation that had no winners, only losers. Sophia, the unexpected heroine, held the folded note, a symbol of her honesty, a testament to her upbringing. Sterling, the villain of his own story, waited, his heart beating with an unfamiliar rhythm, a mixture of frustration and fascination. Sophia's mother, Eleanor, continued cleaning, oblivious to the battle raging between her daughter and her boss. Her presence was a kind of shield, an invisible protection for Sophia, but the girl didn't need protection. She was her own defense, her own fortress. She didn't fear Sterling or the money. She didn't feel the pressure. She felt only the certainty of what was right, a moral compass that never wavered. And that certainty was the most threatening thing Alexander Sterling had ever faced. Sophia's dilemma wasn't about money, it was about truth. It was about fidelity. It was about honoring herself and her mother. And money, that crisp green sheet of paper, was just an object that represented temptation, a shortcut, ease. And Sophia, in her childlike wisdom, knew that shortcuts lead to unknown places, and ease comes at a very high price. She didn't want ease, she wanted dignity. Sterling, a master reader of people, couldn't read Sophia. She was a book with blank pages, a riddle he couldn't decipher. He tried to find the greed in her eyes, but found only honesty. He tried to see the malice in her hands, but found only purity. He was in unfamiliar territory, and the feeling was terrifying. He, who controlled everything, was at the mercy of what he couldn't control, a child's morality. The humiliation he planned for the girl and her mother was beginning to backfire on him. Every second of silence was a blow to his ego. Every glance from Sophia was an arrow piercing his armor of cynicism. He was exposed, vulnerable. The man who saw the world as a game of greed was being forced to face the possibility that he was wrong. And the prospect of being wrong was more frightening than any financial loss. He was the king of a castle built on shifting sands. Alexander Sterling's test wasn't a test for Sophia. It was a test for himself. He wasn't trying to prove that people were corrupt. He was trying to convince himself that he wasn't the only one. He was seeking companionship in his moral solitude, but the girl, in her simplicity, was denying him that companionship. She was showing him that goodness existed, that dignity was real. And for a man who had built his life on the belief in the opposite, this was the worst betrayal of all. The scene was at breaking point. Sterling's breathing was shallow. His eyes were fixed on the girl. The sound of the Swiss watch seemed like a distant echo. Sophia's mother, oblivious, continued her work, and Sophia, the little sphinx, rose from her chair, the folded note still in her hand. She didn't make a sound. She simply stood, and the movement was so majestic, so full of purpose, that Sterling's heart skipped a beat. He was about to witness the end of his experiment and the beginning of his redemption. The girl walked, with small but steady steps, toward Alexander Sterling's chair. Each step was a heartbeat for him. The distance between them, once a difference in class and power, was now just a space to be crossed. And with each step, Sterling's conviction that he was right weakened. He couldn't believe what was about to happen. He had planned the scene, but the script was being rewritten by an 8-year-old, and he was merely a spectator, shocked and terrified. The silence was deafening. The mother, with her back turned, was the only element of peace amidst the gathering storm. The orange crayon had fallen from Sophia's hand, and the bright color on the floor seemed an ironic contrast to the grayness of the situation. The note in her hands was a beacon, and Sterling, the castaway, was about to be rescued, whether he wanted to or not. The test wasn't about the girl's honesty, it was about his own, and he was about to fail at his own game. The girl stopped in front of Sterling. The distance between them was only 3 feet, but the moral distance was light years. She, dignity; he, cynicism; and between them, the $100 bill, the bridge that both united and separated them. Sterling's breathing was so shallow it seemed to have stopped. He couldn't believe it. The girl he had so easily judged was there, in front of him, ready to give her final answer. The answer he hadn't expected, but which, deep down, he needed. And the humility of that moment, for him, was the greatest terror of all. The girl stopped in front of Alexander Sterling. The air, once heavy with anticipation, was now thick with impending reality. She held out her hand, small and pale, holding the folded note. Sterling, still reclining, his eyes barely open, saw the hand in a blur of colors. He expected a gesture, a silent plea, something he could decipher and dismiss. But what he received was an act of pure and simple honesty. It was like an arrow to his heart, a pain he hadn't felt in a long time, the pain of surprise. He who had seen humanity at its worst, who had built an empire on the foundation of cynicism, was now faced with proof that his worldview was wrong. Sophia's outstretched hand was more than a gesture of retribution. It was a silent accusation, a moral lesson he hadn't asked for. He, who tested others, was being tested, and he, the judge, was being judged. The silence of the room was a mute testimony to his impending defeat, a defeat he hadn't even foreseen. Sophia, with her childlike dignity, didn't look away. She looked him straight in the eye, without fear, without the forced humility he expected. Her face was a blank canvas, but her eyes, those deep wells, told a whole story. They said, "I know what this means, and I know what I'm doing." The girl's act was more than just returning money. It was the return of her own morality, proof that the human soul could be cleansed, immune to the filth of greed. Sterling opened his eyes fully. The sleep mask fell away, revealing the shock on his face. He hadn't expected this. The turnaround was so complete, so unexpected, it took his breath away. What he expected was the triumph of cynicism, the validation of his worldview. What he received was the triumph of innocence, the overthrow of his fortress of disillusionment. The note in his hand was the ticket to a world he had forgotten, a world where honesty was a value, not a weakness. He couldn't speak. His words, once like sharp blades, stuck in his throat. He tried to find sarcasm, irony, but there was none. The simplicity of the girl's gesture had completely disarmed him. He looked from the note to her face, then back to his mother, who continued cleaning, oblivious to the scene. Silence, once a tool of power for Sterling, was now a mirror, and he saw his own ugliness reflected in it. He was the oppressor, the unfair judge, the cynic. Sterling's breathing was shallow and rapid. His heart, a rusty old engine, felt like it had been shocked. He was afraid. Afraid of what? It wasn't the girl or what she might do. It was his own revelation. He was afraid of having to face the possibility that he had been wrong his entire life. The girl was a threat to everything he had built, and the note in her hands was the weapon she had used to tear down his sandcastle. Time stood still. The room, once a stage for Sterling's drama, was now a courtroom for him. The judge was an 8-year-old child, and the evidence was a $100 bill. He looked at the bill, then at the drawing Sophia had made, still on the chair. The flower's vivid colors seemed to scream with the sadness of his soul. He had traded beauty for cynicism, innocence for money, and now the bill was coming due. Sophia, without waiting for an answer, lowered her hand. She didn't sit. She just looked at him for a moment longer, a look that said it all. She wasn't angry nor sad. She felt pity, and the pity of a child was the greatest humiliation he had ever suffered. He who had amassed billions was being reduced to nothing by an act of kindness. The humiliation wasn't Sophia's poverty, but his own moral wealth, and the pain was almost unbearable. Mrs. Elena finally stopped cleaning. She turned, just in time to see her daughter standing in front of her boss. She frowned in confusion. "Sophia?" she called, her voice soft. The girl didn't answer. She just turned and walked back to the chair, and Sterling's gaze, fixed on her, was proof that something fundamental had changed. He no longer saw her as the cleaning lady's daughter. He saw her as a teacher, a prophet, a child who had shown him the truth. He sat in the armchair, still clutching the note. The paper felt like it was burning in his hand. He looked at Sophia's mother, who was now staring at him with a worried expression. She didn't know what had happened, but the tension in the room was palpable. Sterling couldn't explain. He couldn't tell her what his daughter had done. Sophia's dignity was hers, and hers alone. And he, the man he wanted to humiliate, was now the humiliated one, and silence was the only thing keeping him from breaking down. The turnaround wasn't just a surprise, it was an epiphany. Sterling, who had spent his entire life believing in human evil, was forced to face goodness. And what he felt wasn't relief, it was panic. The panic of having to rebuild his life, his philosophy, his soul. The girl, with a single act, had demolished his moral fortress and left him exposed to the world, a world he no longer recognized. A world that was, perhaps, a better place than he thought. The shock on his face was so evident that Mrs. Elena, in her concern, stepped forward. "Mr. Sterling, are you all right?" she asked. Her voice was gentle, but the sound was a knife to Sterling's heart. He wasn't all right. He was broken. Sophia's lesson was more powerful than he could bear. He had tested the girl's dignity, and her dignity had tested him back. And he had failed, and the note in his hand was proof of his defeat. Sterling, his gaze still fixed on the note, felt transported to a moment in his past, a past he had locked in a safe and thrown away the key. At 18, he, a young idealist and newcomer to the city, had found a wallet stuffed with cash and returned it, intact, to its owner, an industrial magnate. Instead of gratitude, he had received a look of disdain and the remark, "Nobody returns money, kid. You're naive. Life will teach you." What followed was a series of betrayals and disappointments that turned that idealist into a cynic. The honesty he had shown that day was not rewarded, but punished. The returned wallet was not a testament to his character, but to his foolishness. And the lesson he had learned was that kindness was a weakness. The upheaval in the office wasn't just about Sophia, it was about Sterling. It was about the redemption he didn't know he needed. Her actions were a mirror that reflected back to him what he had been and what he had become. Her honesty was a reminder of what he had lost. He was no longer the judge, he was the defendant, and the accusation was his own life, built on the ashes of innocence. The note in his hand was the prosecution's evidence, a relic of a world he had sworn did not exist. The shock was so great that he couldn't process the scene. His mind, so accustomed to deciphering complex codes and algorithms, was paralyzed by the simplicity of Sophia's act. He couldn't find a hidden motive, an agenda. There was nothing. The girl had simply done what was right, without expecting reward, without fear of judgment, and the purity of her action was more disturbing to him than any malice. He preferred malice, at least he understood malice. Sterling's mind was in turmoil. He thought about the people who had betrayed him, the deals he had made, the distrust he cultivated like a secret garden. And amidst it all, the image of Sophia, small and dignified, hovered like an accusing angel. He could not deny the truth. She was there, in the flesh, in his own office, showing him that the world he had created was nothing more than a prison. Mrs. Elena finally turned to her daughter, who had returned to her chair. She didn't know what it was about, but she felt the weight of the silence, the tension in the air. She saw her boss's face, the shocked expression, and the note in his hand. She didn't know what to think, her heart filled with silent fear. What had her daughter done? Why was he looking like that? She took another step forward, her hand on her chest, expecting the worst. Time was a slow-flowing river. Sterling felt like a drowning man, being pulled into the depths of his own consciousness. The $100 bill was no longer a piece of paper. It was a symbol, a beacon of light that forced him to see the darkness in his own soul. The girl he had once judged as an archetype of poverty and fragility was, in fact, a beacon of hope, proof that humanity, at its core, could still be good. The revelation was complete. The test had been reversed. Sterling hadn't tested the girl had tested him, and he had been exposed. The humiliation wasn't in being deceived, but in being forced to see the truth. He, the man who ruled the world, was at the mercy of an 8-year-old, and the lesson she taught him was more valuable than his entire fortune. He wasn't just a cynic, he was a man who had forgotten how to love, how to trust, how to live. And the note in his hand was the ticket to a world he had lost. Mrs. Elena, seeing that Sterling didn't speak, approached her daughter. She bent down, stroking Sophia's hair. "Is everything okay, my love?" she whispered, her voice full of concern. Sophia, in her serenity, nodded. "Yes, Mommy. I just returned your money." He dropped it. Sophia's voice was so soft, so childlike, it sounded like a distant echo. And the words, though simple, were a punch to Sterling's gut. "Sir, you dropped this." The phrase, so pure and so full of dignity, echoed in the room. Sterling in his armchair could no longer hide. The truth, naked and raw, was there. The girl hadn't taken the money. She had returned it, and the reason was so simple, so childish, that it completely disarmed him. He was a man who sought complexity in everything, and the solution was simplicity. The girl's dignity was his greatest weakness, and the revelation of his honesty was his greatest humiliation. He looked at the note in his hand, then at Sophia, who was now back to drawing. He no longer saw her as the cleaning lady's daughter. He saw her as a creature from a world he had forgotten, a world where honesty was more valuable than money, where dignity was the greatest wealth. And the note now was not a test object, but an invitation to a world he, the billionaire, would have to rediscover if he wanted to be free from his own prison of cynicism. Silence was the only response he could give. He couldn't thank her. He couldn't explain. He couldn't apologize. The humility of that moment was so great that he felt speechless, breathless, and empty. He, the man of power, was reduced to nothing, and the note in his hand was proof of his moral bankruptcy. The girl, with a single act, had exposed him, and the pain of the truth was stronger than he had ever imagined. The game was over, and the master of the game had lost. The shift in power was subtle but absolute. Sterling, who seconds before had been the billionaire in charge, the master of the game, was now the student. And little Sophia, whom he had dismissed as a mere pawn, was the teacher. He watched her with a mixture of fascination and shame. The note in his hand felt heavier than any fortune he had ever handled. She was no longer a piece of paper, but a beacon illuminating the darkness of his soul. He felt tiny, the king in his sandcastle, about to be swept away by the tide of honesty. Mrs. Elena finally broke the silence. "Sophia," she called, her voice soft but firm. "What did you do?" The girl, in her innocence, looked at her mother. "Mommy, he dropped it," she said, pointing at "Sterling, I just gave it back. You always say to return what doesn't belong to us." The words, though addressed to her mother, struck Sterling like a thunderbolt. "You always say." He, the oppressor, was being vindicated by the girl's morality. Her mother's humility, the lesson she had taught, was Sophia's greatest weapon. And Sterling, the man who disdained dignity, was being disarmed by her. Sophia's mother, Elena, looked from her boss's face to the grade in her hand. She didn't know about but the tension in the air told her something important had happened. She saw the surprise and pain on the man's face, the confusion and dignity on her daughter's. The scene was a living tableau, an ethics lesson being taught without words, only with gestures and looks. And the student, the arrogant billionaire, was learning the greatest lesson of his life, a lesson not found in any textbook nor at any university. The power shift wasn't about money. It was about values. Sterling, for all his wealth, was poor in spirit. Sophia, for all her material poverty, was rich in dignity. The scene was a class clash, not about what they had, but about what they were. And victory wasn't about who had more, but about who was more. And little Sophia, in her quiet dignity, was the true magnate in that room. Her power wasn't in her bank account, but in her soul. Sterling's breathing was shallow. He, the man who had always controlled everything, was at the mercy of what he could not control. Child's morality. The humiliation was not in being robbed, but in being forced to see the truth. He had built his life on the premise that goodness did not exist, and the girl, with a single act, had demolished his fortress and left him exposed. And the pain of exposure was unbearable, more so than any financial loss. The scene was a test of character, not for Sophia, but for Sterling, and he, the judge, had failed. The girl's dignity was a mirror reflecting his own ugliness. He could no longer hide behind his wealth and cynicism. Sophia's purity had disarmed him, and he was now a broken man, forced to face the possibility that he had spent his entire life in error. The note in his hand was proof of his moral bankruptcy, and the lesson he had learned was the most valuable of all. Mrs. Elena finally turned to her boss. She didn't know what to say. Words seemed inadequate. Silence was the only answer that fit at that moment. She saw the pain in Sterling's eyes, the vulnerability he tried to hide. And in her compassion, she felt a pang of pity for him. The man who had everything seemed to have lost it all, and his daughter, the girl who had nothing, seemed to have given him something he couldn't buy. The scene was a lesson in humanity. The power shift was a moment of catharsis. The tension, which had built up throughout the script, was now released. The relief came not from the resolution of a conflict, but from the revelation of a truth. The villain wasn't just cruel, he was a symbol of arrogance and indifference. And the heroine, the marginalized girl, was proof that dignity and honesty are true riches. The scene was a reminder that money doesn't buy character, and poverty doesn't define the soul. The scene was at a turning point. From that moment on, Alexander Sterling's life would change forever. He could no longer return to his world of cynicism. Sophia's innocence had marked him forever. He, the man who had disdained dignity, now saw it as the most precious thing in the world, and the note in his hand was proof that he had passed a new understanding of life. The test he had created had given him a new chance. Mrs. Elena, in her concern, stepped forward. She could no longer remain silent. She needed to understand what was happening. And Sterling's expression, the pain in his eyes, was the only answer she needed. He was no longer the distant boss. He was a man, broken, and in need of an act of kindness, a lesson in dignity. And Sophia, in her innocence, had given him exactly that, and the lesson was more powerful than he had ever imagined. The scene was proof that power lies not in money, but in character. A child's dignity was stronger than a billionaire's arrogance, Sophia's honesty had torn down Sterling's fortress of disillusionment, and the note in his hand was proof that he had been accepted into a new life. The test he had created had given him a new chance, and the lesson he had learned was the most valuable of all. "Okay, I'm writing block 8. Mrs. Elena finally moved. The silence was breaking her insides. She approached the boss's chair, her hands folded on her apron. Her look, which had previously been one of concern, was now a curious mix of dignity and confusion. She saw the paper in Sterling's hand, and then looked at her daughter, who was drawing again, oblivious to the weight of the moment. "Mr. Sterling," she began, her voice soft, "are you okay?" The question was simple, but what she wanted to know was much more complex. She wanted to understand what had happened, what her daughter had done that had changed the atmosphere in the room so drastically. She wanted to understand the pain in her boss's eyes. Alexander Sterling didn't respond immediately. He clutched the note tightly, the wrinkles in the paper deepening under the pressure of his fingers. He looked at Eleanor, at her tired but dignified face, and then at Sophia, who continued to draw her imaginary flower. He, who had built his fortune on cynicism, was now disarmed by the innocence and dignity of a child and her mother. The humiliation wasn't in being discovered, but in being forced to face the truth about himself. He, the man who ruled the world, was at the mercy of a moral lesson he couldn't afford. The billionaire's reaction was that of a man caught in a crime he himself had committed. He couldn't explain. He couldn't apologize. Words held no weight, no meaning. He who had built his life on logic and reason was now at the mercy of something he couldn't calculate. Human feeling, Elena's dignity, Sophia's honesty, the innocence of the drawing. Everything was a punch to the gut, and the only thing he could do was remain silent, holding the note, the proof of his defeat. The scene was witnessed by the office's invisible witnesses, the artwork, the ebony furniture, the panoramic windows, and they seemed to laugh at him. The man who disdained humanity was now being forced to face his own. The scene was a mirror, and he didn't like what he saw. He wasn't a noble and wise tycoon. He was a bitter and lonely man who had lost faith in humanity and was now being forced to reconsider everything. And worst of all, he had no one to blame but himself. The silence was so heavy that Elena felt the need to fill it. She took another step forward, her hand reaching out in a gesture of help. "Sir, if there's anything I can do," she began, her voice filled with genuine concern. But Sterling cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "No," whispered his voice hoarse. There's nothing you can do." And the denial wasn't a refusal of her help, but a confession. The confession that he was broken, and that the only person who could help him was himself. The scene was a moment of catharsis. The power that had once belonged to Sterling now belonged to Sophia and her mother. They controlled him not with money, but with dignity. And the lesson was clear. True wealth lies not in bank accounts, but in the soul. And the note in Sterling's hand was no longer a piece of paper. It was a symbol of humility, a symbol of honesty, a symbol of hope. And he, the man who had scorned all of this, was now at the mercy of the hardest lesson of his life. Sterling, his gaze still fixed on the note, felt the utter failure of his life philosophy. He, who had amassed billions, was spiritually poor. Sophia, the girl who had nothing, was the true wealth. The conclusion he reached was not just intellectual, but emotional. He had spent his entire life in pursuit of money and power, and in the end, what he needed was dignity. And he found it, unexpectedly, in the hands of a child he had judged. The turnaround was more than an act of honesty. It was an act of mercy. Sophia didn't test him. She saved him from himself. He didn't move. The silence was a lesson. The note in his hand was proof. His mother, Eleanor, still looked at him with the same quiet dignity he had noticed on the first day. He respected her not for her work, but for her soul. She was the source of Sophia's dignity. She was the source of his own lesson. The businessman, the arrogant billionaire, was on the verge of an epiphany. Life was not a quest for money, but a quest for meaning. And meaning, he had just discovered, lay in honesty and dignity. The scene faded into a symbolic conclusion. Sophia, the silent heroine, went back to drawing. The sound of crayons on paper was the only thing breaking the silence. It was the sound of innocence, the sound of truth. And Sterling, the villain of his own story, was now on the sidelines, a spectator of his own redemption. He needed nothing more. He had the note, he had the lesson, and he had the hope that he could change. The lesson wasn't just about honesty, it was about humanity. From that day on, Alexander Sterling's life would change forever. He would not return to his world of cynicism. Sophia's innocence had marked him forever. He, the man who had disdained dignity, now saw it as the most precious thing in the world. And the note in his hand was proof that he had been accepted into a new life. The test he had created had given him a new chance, and the lesson he had learned was the most valuable of all. The ending doesn't need to be completely definitive. It should leave a strong emotional image and a clear moral lesson. Suggest that the characters' futures have changed, but without revealing exactly how. The script closes with an emotional image that symbolizes the turning point. Sophia in her dignity and Sterling in his vulnerability, and the note, proof that power lies not in money but in character. The script ends, but the story continues in Sterling's soul. The conclusion wasn't about money, it was about the human soul. Sterling, the man who had scorned kindness, was forced to face it, and what he felt wasn't relief. It was panic. The panic of having to rebuild his life, his philosophy, his soul. The girl, with a single act, had demolished his moral fortress and left him exposed to the world, a world he no longer recognized, a world that was, perhaps, a better place than he thought. And the note in his hand was proof of his moral bankruptcy. Mrs. Elena, in her concern, stepped forward. She could no longer remain silent. She needed to understand what was happening, and Sterling's expression, the pain in his eyes, was the only answer she needed. He was no longer the distant boss. He was a man, broken and in need of an act of kindness, a lesson in dignity. And Sophia, in her innocence, had given him exactly that, and the lesson was more powerful than he had ever imagined. The scene was proof that power lies not in money, but in character. A child's dignity was stronger than a billionaire's arrogance. Sophia's honesty had torn down Sterling's fortress of disillusionment, and the note in his hand was proof that he had been accepted into a new life. The test he had created had given him a new chance. And the lesson he had learned was the most valuable of all. The ending, therefore, is not about what happens next, but about what happened in that moment. The emotional turning point, the revelation, the epiphany. The script closes with the image of Sterling, the broke billionaire, and Sophia, the rich-spirited child. The image is a lesson in humanity, proof that kindness, dignity, and honesty are the true riches. And the note in her hand is the symbol of all this. The story continues, but the script ends with a lesson. The scene was proof that humility, dignity, and honesty are the true riches. Sterling's arrogance had been defeated by Sophia's purity, and the note, which he had used to test the girl, was now a reminder of his own moral bankruptcy. The lesson was more powerful than he had ever imagined, and the outcome, though open-ended, is a promise that Sterling's future would be different, marked by the dignity he had found in the hands of a child. The script ends with the image of Sterling, the broke billionaire, and Sophia, the child with a rich soul. The image is a lesson in humanity, proof that kindness, dignity, and honesty are true riches, and the note in her hand is the symbol of all this. The story continues, but the script ends with a lesson. The last image is of Sophia. She's back in the large leather armchair, orange crayon in hand. On her small pad of paper, the flower she was drawing now has more vibrant colors. She seems oblivious to the emotional storm she's just endured, to the lesson she unwittingly taught a man who thought he had it all. Her feet dangle in the air, and her grey wool coat seems less a symbol of poverty and more a cloak of dignity. The sunlight, which once shone on Sterling's power, now illuminates the girl's serenity, the true richness of that room. The image is one of unshakable innocence, proof that honesty and kindness cannot be bought or lost. The script closes with Sterling. He sits in his armchair, the $100 bill still in his hand. He clutches it tightly, as if it were a talisman, a reminder of what he had lost and what he had found. His eyes are fixed on space, and the expression on his face is not one of anger or frustration, but of deep, quiet recognition. He is a broken man, but broken for the better. The castle of cynicism he had built has been demolished by a single act of kindness, and he is now at the mercy of a new life. The outcome is not about what he will do, but about what he has become. The final image is a portrait of contrasts. The billionaire in his luxurious armchair and the child in his faded coat. The money in his hand and the dignity in her soul. The silence of the office and the sound of crayons. The image is a lesson in humanity, proof that kindness, dignity, and honesty are true riches, and the note in her hand is the symbol of all this. The story continues, but the script ends with a lesson. The final scene is one of quiet dignity. Sterling, the man of power, was disarmed by Sophia's purity, and the note which he had used to test the girl was now a reminder of his own moral bankruptcy. The lesson was more powerful than he had ever imagined, and the ending, though open-ended, is a promise that Sterling's future would be different, marked by the dignity he had found in the hands of a child. The script closes with the image of Sterling, the broke billionaire, and Sophia, the rich, spirited child. The image is a lesson in humanity, proof that kindness, dignity, and honesty are true riches, and the note in her hand is the symbol of all this. The story continues, but the script ends with a lesson. The last line of the script isn't a line, but a thought that echoes in the silence of the office. It's the narrator's voice, summing up the emotional turnaround. I may never know who she is, but he finally knew who he was.